couple of things. You mentioned a number of minerals. You mentioned cobalt. You mentioned lithium that is actually powering the transition discourse. I want to come back to the room before going back online and bring in Dr. Dube. You know, it is believed that it's Africa that is powering the transition conversation. It is about our lithium, our cobalt that Memory has spoken about. If you were accidentally given 3 minutes with African ministers of energy who are currently pushing for an African common position on energy access and transition to be adopted at COP27, what will be your advice to them?
I think, first of all, recognizing the important points that have already been raised by the other speakers regarding issues of the differences in finance for mitigation and adaptation. And just before I respond on my 3 minutes, to also emphasize on the fact that climate finance is owed and it is something that should be paid for previous sins. I think in the 3 minutes, I would actually center my argument on issues related to stranded assets. Mohamed spoke of the need for a reduction in total movement away from fossil fuel production, but he also highlighted the just transition, something which I also think is very critical. But my perspective is slightly different. I think the energy deficit that we face is a critical deficit that we should pay attention to. And when we really look at it, we should be able to consider the challenges that fossil fuels actually bring. Fossil fuels on their own are not a major problem. The challenge is the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases that they emit that abate and push the climate challenges that we see. So I would actually advise the energy ministers or the energy authorities to rethink the dimensions of fossil fuels. Is it possible for Africa to start considering methodologies of capturing the excess carbon dioxide that is emitted? Is it possible for our scientists to start looking at alternative dimensions? This has been done in certain parts. We have got pre- and post-combustion technologies that allow for the capturing of the carbon dioxide, that allow for the storage of the carbon dioxide, and allow you to continue using the fuels to ensure that we reduce the energy deficit, which I think is a much bigger problem. So we are always told to move to renewable energy, which is very good. We don't want to be locked into non-productive fossil fuels in future, but every time when others have a crisis, you'll see what happened in the global north during the war in Ukraine and Russia now. They started to import fossil fuels again, heavy tripling and quadrupling the imports of coal and so on. But are we supposed to simply stop producing, using what we have and stranding our assets? I think I would say maybe we need to think a bit deeper. Can we look for a just middle point where we look for alternative technologies, where we also try to understand that the energy deficit is real and try to find a midpoint between renewable energy and fossil fuel energy?
I wanted to kind of continue the themes that have been coming out of this conference the last 2 days. And the first one is about dismantling, and the second one is about one voice and solidarity. Because we've been talking a lot about dismantling the global financial architecture, and I think in order to do that, we also need to stop thinking about private finance as being a solution towards any kind of climate financing or debt relief or anything. So this is linked to the point of climate reparations and debt reparations. Just cancel it. But it, like Dr. Nzana also said yesterday, our biggest problem is ourselves. And he bet us that even if we cancelled all debt, we'd be in the same position as we were. And there's, and there's proof of that. Even after the debt jubilee in 2000, again, we find ourselves, highly indebted and distressed. So we need to really think about, what finance will do for us. And the problem with thinking that private finance is a solution, yes, it can solve many things. But again, it's then it's subject to the priorities of investors, and a lot of them we've seen are focusing on renewables as opposed to other priorities in Africa like loss and damage. So let's not diminish the role of public finance just yet, and how much we can generate for ourselves, how much we need to improve our economic governance systems locally to enable us to, have a better say. Like again, I don't know if was it Dr. Patrick again who talked about financial independence, meaning knowledge independence. And if we remember rightly, it was public finance that bails out companies in times of distress, and public finance that bailed out Wall Street. So moving on from that now to solidarity, because if we solve this either through public or private finance, we're still going to be subject to the priorities of the developed countries in terms of climate financing, or to investors, and who only really want to deal with renewables. So I wanted to speak about solidarity, and I like that Dr. Dube has talked about scientists and other alternatives, solutions to CO2 emissions, because other than capturing CO2, there are scientists are also looking at removing CO2. So other than decarbonizing, they're looking at restoring oceans. And we're forgetting that this Earth is comprised 72% of ocean. And there's this group of scientists who were building on the work of John Martin's work in 1980s, who decided to sprinkle a little bit of mineral ore dust into the oceans, and found that it made plankton bloom and it regenerated oceans, and it's able to remove almost all, or at least 2/3 of CO2 emissions. So it's not just about decarbonizing or capturing CO2, it's also about removing it. But do we see us as civil society providing solidarity to scientists and environmentalists? And my challenge for us as civil society is, let's move this beyond. I know there's been a lot of talk about moving this beyond the conferences and to people, the wananchi. Let's move it to scientists also, environmentalists. Let's find the Greta Thunbergs out there and scientists like Russ George who are trying to pasteurize the oceans. His work was shut down in 2013 by a SWAT team in Canada because, I don't know, they're afraid of solutions that can be quicker, cheaper, easier, take less time. And if you remember the fable of Chicken Licken, who was afraid of the sky falling down because she felt an acorn hit her. And she mobilized everyone, and they all ran because they're afraid of the sky, and they took shelter somewhere. And then they realized that it wasn't falling down, it was just an acorn. And I feel sometimes when we build machines and we become very bureaucratic and we see one way, climate finance must happen this way. Yes, it is one way. We do need reparations. But there are also other cheaper, easier solutions that we're not thinking of. And we're forgetting about the scientists outside of this room who may have better solutions than what we've been thinking about all this time. So what was the question? Did I answer your question? Oh, okay, tax. Okay, let me get to tax. So I think the principles of taxation, they apply also to this question about debt and climate change and just energy transition, because, I was trying to triangulate how do I come up with an intervention that addresses all three? So if we're generating money for climate justice, it still has to speak to the principles of taxation and debt management. So the idea is about redistributing wealth, which is reparations, climate reparations that they're talking about, repricing, the polluter pay principle, being representative, so allowing us to speak as one, and then generating revenue from the right places. So when we say that these multinationals are not paying the revenue, what that means is, okay, they're enriching themselves. It means they're making riskier investments, which causes a lot of debt, by the way. That was the cause of the global financial crisis, these risky speculative investments, which create even more wealth concentration to a few. So in the same way that so I was just trying to bridge the gap between the 4 R's of taxation, but also debt management and climate change.
I also agree with a skills deficit when it comes to the utilization of those things that are supposed to assist us in dealing with the challenges related to climate change. So we cannot address this deficit, however, without a plan of action. First of all, we need to be clear on how we are going to structure the just transition, how long it will take, what is the midpoint, what is the beginning, what is the end game. Only when we know what the midpoint is, the beginning and the end game, can we build the necessary skills for the different points as well. So we need to know what sort of issues we're going to be dealing with. Are we going to be moving more towards renewable energy? Are we going to be doing carbon sequestration? What are we doing? So that if we know what we're doing, then we're able to build the correct skills. There is an issue which was also raised by my brother there, which I just want to add. I totally agree with the points that you are highlighting, where there is no midpoint. But we are increasingly starting to see other challenges related to the monetization of climate change itself, where a problem that was started by the global north is now being paid for dearly by the global south, including the small farmer. So there is now what we call loss and damage or weather indexed insurance, where a lot of people are pushing this, and the ARC has been pushing this to governments, and soon we are starting to see small farmers being encouraged to also take out weather-based insurance. What this technically means is the small little farmer in a small plot is actually now subsidizing the sins of very big people, because we are now monetizing the idea of climate change instead of being honest that it was a problem created by others and the polluter is supposed to pay. And related to that, we're increasingly seeing the utilization of public funds, where we want to enhance or attract private players using the public funds, where the Green Climate Fund or whoever puts out some money, and then we're supposed to leverage this money to try and attract the bigger players, which is something which is an anomaly in all honesty, because we cannot be using public funds which were created through a problem by the private players to attract the very same private players.
I wanted to address the question about gender, and in so doing also introduce you to another project called the Drawdown Project. And one of the biggest ways that they propose for decarbonization is educating girls and family planning. Because if you do so, not only do you get, this human capital that can be able to address, climate change in the future, but then you also, you reduce consumption, human consumption in general, in terms of food, in terms of transport, and the population at large. So in terms of engendering the climate change and discussions, we need to invest in our women and girls. We need to educate them, and we need to promote family planning. I also want to respond to the brother at the back who's talking about accountability, because I wholeheartedly agree with you. And the reason why a lot of the work that's been happening at the UN is we're not getting the investments that we need is precisely because it's voluntary. And as long as it's voluntary and there's a free rider issue going on, and they don't feel compelled to pay, then we're going to continue in this way, like Dr. Nduba said, where small farmers are subsidizing the sins of the big people.
Where do we want to go? What do we want to get there, and how do we get there in terms of social, economic, and environmental objectives as a country? Those questions still remain relevant, and it will help us solve a lot of issues. Then we invest in the right skills.
If we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the reports, as well as scientific reports in general, we see that we have no time. Climate impacts are here. They are especially in the global south, especially in Africa. The climate crisis has revealed itself, and the impacts are clear. And as time passes, with the inaction that international governments or governments of the world are following, it's going to get a lot worse. We need to cut emissions by global emissions by 45% by 2030 in order to remain under 1.5. That entails that there are no new investment is put into fossil fuels. Of course, there is the global north's hypocrisy, where investments continue to happen, and the biggest carbon bombs are being invested in the United States. But that does not mean that we should follow suit. And renewables are becoming cheaper. It's about getting the funding and getting the investments into Africa for those renewables. And we really need to be cautious of false solutions. There are so many being thrown out there. A technology such as carbon capture and storage has not proven its economic viability and financial viability. Geoengineering is being pushed on African states right and left. And these solutions will continue the unjust economic system that we are subjected to, that force us into extractivism and depletion and destruction of our nature, in order for multinationals to profit and further increase the gulf or the gap between the global north and the global south. We cannot bet on a miracle technological solution that will solve our problems. We need to work with the science, and we need to be very careful with it. There are many, many examples in history where scientists have completely disrupted ecosystems because they did not follow the scientific methodology and did not take things as needed, with the time needed. And therefore, we really need to be cautious on this. Nature restoration is essential. There is already too much carbon in the atmosphere. We need to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. We are far above 350 parts per million. And therefore, protecting our forests, protecting our oceans, and restoring them is a number one priority. Of course, I think we need to recognize that the least responsible for the climate emergency are the ones that are most impacted, that pay the highest price. And this price marginalizes them further, and makes them even less resilient to climate change impacts. And this is where the need for loss and damage finance comes in. And in here, there are also many false solutions being pushed. Many of these insurance schemes are likely only to enrich insurance company executives. Loss and damage finance needs to come through accountability and liability of those responsible for climate change. The polluters need to pay. We cannot, my final comment in response to an important point made on the floor, we cannot sit around and wait for this finance and for it to be handed down. We need to fight for it. We need to develop agency to look internally into our countries, into our communities, to look for innovative solutions, look for alternative development pathways. We do not want to be the US with McDonald's at every corner and overconsumption. We need to find a different way of living, one that prioritizes people's health, people's security, safety, and futures. And that paradigm shift is essential for us to move forward, and it needs to come from our power. A very interesting statistic that came out in the IPCC report, Working Group 2 in February, is that the research on climate change on the African continent, over 90% of it was conducted by universities and research institutes not from the continent. We need to deepen our knowledge about our condition, our situation, about our environment in order to find solutions locally.
Thank you
we need
so
to
much,
invest
Ahmed.
in ourselves and in our youth in order to protect our future.
One of the things that we were really emphasizing as African feminists globally is that we need to change how economies are structured and offer alternative economies that really work for us. And if we take the same trajectory that developed countries, the countries in the north have taken, that is not going to work for us. So I think it's a wake-up call. We've already seen how that trajectory that injects a lot of fossil fuels, that is not the solution for us. So I think we need to come together and start thinking our solutions should really be based on a trajectory that offers an alternative economic model. Measuring our way of measuring our economics really needs to fundamentally change. And I think we need to reflect strongly and very honestly about the repercussions of continuing, especially with the kind of debt burden that we actually have for now. The conditionalities that are coming through, this is something that we really need to resist, and we need to have a common agenda. And I think joining forces, Mohamed talked about it. How do we join forces that as member states, as civil society, even the private sector are actually recognizing the issues that we are talking about and not in isolation. So I think going forward, we need to come together in solidarity, but also in resistance. Ahmed was also talking about, we need to set the agenda, but we also need to ensure that we are inclusive and we are able to ensure that we are looking at all the intersections in terms of the solutions that we are putting forward.
Our continent has been controlled by outside interest. We've just become a resource pool for extraction and export, but also a dumping ground for the practices and technologies no longer wanted elsewhere. I'll take the example of geoengineering because I've had a colleague in the panel posit that it's possible to suck carbon out of the atmosphere on a massive scale, either using biological or mechanical methods. And I want to just disabuse this notion from Africans. We've said we haven't caused the climate problem. Our continent only is responsible for about 4% of the historic emission of the 4% of the annual emissions, and we are home to 17% of the global population. But when you look at the historic emissions, we only account for 0.5% of the emissions. So this notion that we can actually turn to geoengineering, which we know doesn't work, is only going to distract us from the real solutions. There's no quick fix. Geoengineering only threatens to delay the implementation of a transition away from fossil fuels. And what it will also do is redirect the much needed funding and investment that is needed for the transition from the real solutions. And that will require vast amount of money, vast amount of energy, and that is actually going to present huge risk. My word of caution to my dear African colleagues on this call, because I care how we present ourselves, particularly on these issues, is for us to reject false solutions, including geoengineering. Let's not allow our beloved continent to become the guinea pig for the world's dangerous experiment. So that's my first message. My second message is this, and I think it's important for all of us to think about it. The UNFCCC, the way it has been structured, organized, and the negotiations that happened for the last 30 years haven't worked. So rather than reducing emissions, what we've had is the increase in emissions. So think of 1992 when they had agreed the UN Convention on Climate Change, in 2007 when they had agreed the Kyoto Protocol, 2015 when they had agreed the Paris Agreement. So rather than having a reduction in emissions throughout this period, we've actually had increase in emissions. And so what we need now is to actually supercharge the decarbonization of the global energy system. That is the only way we can actually avoid dangerous climate change. You cannot deliver that if you're going to make an argument. This is the other point I wanted to also react to, that it's possible for Africa to consider fossil gas as a transition fuel. I think our continent faces the stark choice between following the failed old approach of the current industrialized countries or transitioning to the energy of the future. And so this stark choice is going to either decide we either follow the failed approach, we develop energy infrastructure for export. It's going to be old, dirty. It's going to be the kind that failed and caused the climate problem, that is harming people, that is harming communities, it's harming our water and nature. And it's going to be, dominated by corporations, mostly Western corporations. That is not going to address the energy poverty of our 600 million people. It's not going to help address the climate crisis. In fact, it's going to result in further destruction and ecological collapse. To respond to this dash for gas or this scramble for gas, we've come up with a campaign that I will invite you to actually join. It's called Don't Gas Africa, don'tgasafrica.org. Visit that website. You'll find a sign-on letter where we've explained why locking Africa on an energy pathway that is going to risk an overshoot of 1.5 degree, that is not going to deliver the energy access to the current 600 million people without energy access, is not going to help Africa's well-being, Africa's prosperity. And so the idea here for us, and I think it's important, particularly for the economists in this room, for us to think we are not polluters. We want to continue to develop, but develop along a clean path. And the way climate finance is currently set up, and I think this is important for all of us to be aware, it privileges and rewards the polluter. You're basically allowed to develop in a dirty way, increase emissions, and then you qualify for climate mitigation finance to then clean your act. What we need is money, and climate finance particularly, being made available to allow Africa to develop along a clean path. I think we can't shy away from the fact that we have a very weak institutional and regulatory capacity in the continent of Africa. We're talking about climate, but do you guys know that our own climate negotiators are currently being coordinated by UNEP, even though we have the Africa Union, for example. So there is actually weak institutional capacity. There is inappropriate regulatory frameworks. And these things cannot be underestimated. And it's only through engagement by African experts from across the fields, the various fields, that can actually allow us to address these major bottlenecks. Let's decolonize our economies. Let's decolonize our development. Let's decolonize our energy. Let's demand the historic polluters pay their climate debt and deliver reparations so that we can actually be able to leapfrog. Let's not fall for false solutions. Let's build solidarity amongst ourselves so that we can reset how Africa economies develop, how Africa prospers, and how Africa engages in the international climate negotiations so that we can weed out injustice. We can deliver climate justice for Africa and for the world.